In 1944, amid World War II, an entire Waffen-SS unit vanished, without a single shot fired.
Over 800 Ukrainians planned to rise up against this small German staff, once they had killed them, disappear into the countryside and join the French resistance.
This wasn't a battle. It was a secret mutiny led by Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian conscripts stationed in Nazi-occupied France. They turned on their German commanders in a silent act of defiance that stunned the SS. Today, we uncover how Ukrainian soldiers helped dismantle the unit from within, rewriting the rules of war. Discover one of World War II's most hidden, haunting rebellions. Waffen-SS. The history of the Waffen-SS is one of the most volatile and disturbing chapters of Nazi Germany's rise and fall, short in duration, but immense in brutality and complexity. Emerging in the early 1920s and disbanded by 1945 with the collapse of the Third Reich, the Waffen-SS evolved from a small paramilitary guard to a massive and ideologically driven military force. Despite its limited lifespan, its evolution was anything but straightforward. Shaped by Nazi ideology, political opportunism, and the chaos of wartime decision-making, the Waffen-SS developed in fractured phases, each deeply marked by violence, ideological extremism, and organizational shifts. The first phase, stretching through the 1930s up to the early war years, 1939 to 1940, was foundational. This period saw Heinrich Himmler's SS move from a personal guard unit for Adolf Hitler to a broader political and policing tool of the Nazi state. During these early years, the Waffen-SS had a negligible presence on the battlefield. Instead, the focus was on embedding the SS into Nazi Germany's ideological, legal, and political systems. The SS established a distinct identity separate from the Wehrmacht, the regular German army, and the groundwork was laid for the creation of a militarized wing, the Waffen-SS. Although limited in size and experience, these early units participated in campaigns in Poland and the Low Countries, where their brutality and loyalty to Hitler quickly became apparent. The second major phase, from 1941 to 1943, was triggered by Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. This campaign marked a turning point in both the scale and character of the Waffen-SS. Himmler's influence surged, and with Hitler's increasing distrust of traditional military leadership, the Waffen-SS gained stature as an elite ideological army. No longer just a support force, it now took center stage in some of the most vicious campaigns on the Eastern Front. But this expansion came at a cost. The Waffen-SS rapidly grew in size, absorbing not just Germans but also volunteers and conscripts from across Europe. Training standards declined, and the influx of non-German recruits diluted its earlier image of Aryan purity, though the Nazi regime still tried to spin this inclusion through racial hierarchies. This period also witnessed an escalation in the SS's role in atrocities. The Eastern Campaign was not just a war of conquest, it was a war of annihilation. The Waffen-SS played a direct role in massacres, executions, and the enforcement of genocidal policies against Jews, partisans, and Soviet POWs. As the front lines moved deeper into Soviet territory, the distinction between military combat and ideological terror blurred almost completely. By 1943, even as defeat loomed in the distance, the Waffen-SS was at the height of its political power and military expansion, symbolizing both the ruthless ambition and the fatal contradictions of the Nazi regime. The battleground that broke Nazi Germany. The Eastern Front of World War II was not just a military campaign, it was the epicenter of the most brutal and transformative conflict in modern history. Known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, and referred to in Germany and Ukraine as the German-Soviet War, this colossal theater of war saw Axis and Allied powers clashing from the Baltic to the Balkans. Spanning from June 22, 1941 to May 9, 1945, it covered vast swaths of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe and determined the very fate of Nazi Germany. When Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, millions of German troops surged across the Soviet border with the intent of a swift, crushing victory. Initial Axis advances were devastatingly effective, pushing deep into Soviet territory and threatening Moscow by late 1941. Soviet defenses crumbled in the face of the Blitzkrieg, and many assumed the USSR would collapse under the onslaught. But the tide would soon turn. Failing to capture Moscow marked the first major stumbling block for the Nazis. Shifting their focus southward, they launched Case Blue in June 1942, aiming to seize the oil-rich Caucasus region. This led to the infamous Battle of Stalingrad, a brutal urban struggle that lasted months and cost an estimated 2 million lives. It wasn't just the bloodiest battle of World War II, it was one of the deadliest in human history. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was more than symbolic. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and began a relentless Soviet counteroffensive. From 1943 onward, the Red Army regained territory, fortified by a combination of industrial output, manpower reserves, and bitter experience. The Battle of Kursk in July-August 1943, the largest tank battle in history, marked the final major German offensive on the Eastern Front. After their defeat there, Germany's ability to conduct large-scale attacks was effectively destroyed. From that point, the Wehrmacht was on the defensive. Soviet forces pushed westward with growing momentum, liberating Kiev, Minsk, Warsaw, and eventually storming into eastern Germany. Former Axis allies like Romania and Bulgaria, seeing the writing on the wall, switched sides. By April 1945, Soviet troops had encircled Berlin, and after weeks of intense fighting, the German capital fell. On May 8th, Germany officially surrendered, bringing the war in Europe to a close. The human cost was staggering. Of the 85 million people who died in World War II, over 30 million perished on the Eastern Front, including 9 million children. More than 80% of the total combat of the war unfolded here, according to historian Jeffrey Roberts. It wasn't just the largest front, it was the decisive one. The Eastern Front didn't just end Nazi Germany, it reshaped the geopolitical map for decades to come. Forgotten division of desperation. During the final desperate phase of World War II, the 30th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Belarusian, emerged as a tragic and complex formation, one that encapsulates the chaos, survival instincts, and shattered allegiances of Eastern Europe in 1944. Originally known as the 30th Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, this unit was formed in August 1944 in German-occupied Warsaw from the remnants of the Schutzmannschaft Brigade Ziegling, composed of Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians. However, unlike other SS divisions born from ideological conviction, this one was cobbled together from scattered survivors, disillusioned ex-soldiers, starving POWs, reluctant volunteers, and conscripted civilians trapped between collapsing empires. Ukraine, where many of these men came from or fought in, was one of the most brutalized territories of the Second World War. Caught between the hammer of the Soviet Union and the anvil of Nazi Germany, the Ukrainian population experienced forced deportations, mass killings, and the ravages of shifting occupations. While millions of Ukrainians fought in the Soviet Red Army, others aligned with Germany, some hoping to leverage Nazi support for independence, others simply trying to survive. Resistance fighters, meanwhile, often found themselves battling both sides. The human toll was staggering. Historians like Michael Haynes estimate total Soviet wartime deaths between 26.6 and 42.7 million, with Ukraine bearing a disproportionate share. Over 1.7 million Ukrainian Jews were systematically murdered in the Holocaust, largely with the help of local collaborators. The front lines moved through Ukrainian territory repeatedly, razing villages, starving cities, and displacing millions. In this apocalyptic context, the 1st Belarusian Division was less a fighting force and more a makeshift group bound by desperation. Some of its men were Red Army defectors who had faced starvation in German POW camps before being offered a grim choice: die behind barbed wire or switch uniforms. Others were members of nationalist militias, Ukrainian or Belarusian, seduced by vague Nazi promises of autonomy that never came. Many weren't Nazis, nor true believers. They were survivors. Their loyalties were fragmented, shaped by trauma and fear rather than ideology. When the division was finally deployed, it was poorly equipped, barely trained, and internally fractured. It was an army in name only, an echo of larger forces collapsing all across the Eastern Front. In a tragic twist, the division was wiped out without firing a single coordinated shot. Many of its men were either killed, captured, or deserted. In some cases, entire units surrendered or switched sides. Silent defiance within. Why didn't the Soviet military intervene to stop the collapse of the USSR in 1991? At first glance, it seems unthinkable. One of the world's largest military forces stood by as the Soviet state unraveled. But to understand this inaction, we must dive deep into the theories of civil-military relations, particularly one explanation that stands out above the rest: organizational culture. Rather than viewing the Soviet army as a monolithic tool of repression, this framework examines the values, beliefs, and internal norms of military officers. Decades of indoctrination, combined with an emphasis on political loyalty over initiative, had bred a culture of compliance and institutional caution. By 1991, this mindset left the military institutionally unprepared and, in many cases, unwilling to challenge civilian authority, even as the state disintegrated. This theory is most powerfully tested during the August 1991 coup attempt, where a hardline faction attempted to seize control and roll back reforms. But when the time came to enforce their will, many military leaders hesitated. Tanks rolled into Moscow, but soldiers refused to fire on civilians. Elite units held their positions, unsure whether to follow orders or remain neutral. In the end, this paralysis, rooted in the military's internal culture, ensured the coup failed and the USSR's dissolution accelerated. To see how organizational beliefs shape military behavior under extreme conditions, we can look back further to 1941, when the Soviet Union faced another existential threat. During the Nazi invasion of the USSR, Soviet forces conducted brutal retreats, burning infrastructure and evacuating millions beyond the Urals. At the same time, German forces swept through Ukraine, enacting racial policies that led to the deaths of 1.5 million Jews, including atrocities like Babi Yar, where 34,000 were murdered in 2 days. But within this darkness, resistance flickered, even among those within German ranks. One striking example comes from Major Lev Leon Hloba, an Eastern European officer who had risen through the SS. Realizing Germany's defeat was inevitable, Hloba plotted something unprecedented: a silent revolt from within. This wasn't a dramatic shootout or a battlefield uprising. One night, Hloba and his men turned their weapons, not on the Allies, but on their Nazi commanders. They acted with chilling precision: no gunshots, no radio calls, no flares, only knives, bayonets, and stealth. By morning, the German command unit was annihilated. Rather than disappear, these defectors joined the French resistance, or sabotaged German forces from within. Field Marshal Walter Model would later declare the division completely unreliable. In both the Soviet collapse and Hloba's mutiny, we see the power of military culture, not just in battlefield tactics, but in historic decisions of loyalty, resistance, and silence. To understand these moments is to grasp the deeper forces that shape soldiers when they obey, when they rebel, and when they choose to do absolutely nothing at all. Mutiny in the SS. In August 1944, the 30th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS was formed in Warsaw, Poland, an unusual division by SS standards. It consisted primarily of Eastern European recruits, Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians, many of them previously part of the Schutzmannschaft Brigade Siegling, a collaborationist auxiliary police force. Hastily assembled, the division was rushed by train to southeastern France with a clear mission: suppress the growing resistance of the French Forces of the Interior, FFI. But what unfolded over the next few months was one of the most striking betrayals and mutinies within the Nazi military apparatus. Upon arrival, the division's combat effectiveness quickly came into question. The Eastern European soldiers, many of whom had joined the Germans under coercion or false promises, found themselves tasked with rooting out freedom fighters who reminded them more of themselves than of the enemy. Combat morale dropped sharply. Then, in an astonishing turn, 2 battalions mutinied. In a shocking act of rebellion, they assassinated their German commanders and defected voluntarily to the French resistance. This wasn't a chaotic desertion, it was a calculated move. These men didn't flee in panic. They melted into the forests of southeastern France with purpose. At first glance, it seemed as if the division had vanished into thin air. But the truth was far more strategic. Behind the scenes, a small circle of Ukrainian officers had been quietly orchestrating this defection. Among them was Major Lev Loba, a man who had grown deeply disillusioned with Nazi ideology. Loba and his fellow officers had long abandoned hopes of a German victory. Instead, they saw an opportunity, not just for survival, but for redemption. They reached out to the FFI, specifically to a man named Simon Duan, a dairy farmer who had become a key liaison officer for the resistance. An agreement was struck, but not without strict conditions. Duan demanded total loyalty. Any soldier wishing to join the resistance would first have to cut all ties with the SS. That meant more than changing sides. It meant executing their own German commanders to prove they were done with the Nazis for good. This dark ultimatum was met with grim resolve. The defectors carried out these eliminations in silence, sealing their fate as resistance fighters. What began as a Nazi division meant to crush rebellion ended with hundreds of men fighting against the Third Reich, blending into local resistance cells across France. To the German high command, it appeared the division had been swallowed by the forest, lost without a trace. But in truth, it had transformed into something entirely unexpected. A silent dagger pointed back at Berlin. Ukrainians against Nazis. On January 20th, 1942, high-ranking Nazi officials gathered in a quiet Berlin suburb known as Wannsee. This meeting, later called the Vanzi Conference, wasn't just administrative. It was the formal coordination of genocide. Chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most ruthless figures of the Third Reich, the conference laid the bureaucratic and logistical framework for the so-called final solution to the Jewish question, a calculated plan to annihilate every Jew in Europe. The meeting did not mark the start of the Holocaust, but it did mark a turning point. Mass murder would now be industrialized. By the time extermination camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Majdanek, and the gas chambers at Birkenau were fully operational, the Nazi regime and its collaborators had already murdered over 1.5 million Jews, many shot in open fields and forests across Ukraine, Belarus, and the occupied Soviet republics. These massacres, carried out by Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, were the first wave of what would become the largest systematic genocide in human history. But in a stunning reversal of roles, a few years later in 1944, something happened that almost no one expected, especially not the Nazi command. In southern France, 2 Ukrainian battalions serving under the Waffen-SS, the Nazi military arm responsible for some of the worst war crimes, turned against their German officers. These men, once part of the very machinery of oppression, executed a coordinated defection. It wasn't just symbolic. At Vizille, over 800 men deserted. Soon after, hundreds more followed at Val d'Allier. But this was more than a mutiny. It was a full-scale rebellion armed with anti-tank weapons, mortars, heavy machine guns, and tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition. What had once been a Nazi division was now a battle-hardened, well-armed unit ready to fight its former masters. The French resistance, or Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, FFI, quickly absorbed them, designating them as the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian battalions. They were immediately deployed in direct combat against German troops. The transformation was extraordinary. Soldiers who once marched under the SS Death's Head insignia now wore the tricolor of the French resistance and spoke of liberation, not subjugation. French civilians, who had lived in fear of anyone wearing German uniforms, were stunned. These foreign fighters, once enforcers of Nazi terror, were now liberators, proof that even in the darkest moments of war, redemption was possible. Their defection wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a symbolic rupture in the Nazis' myth of unity and control. The Silent Mutiny. In the dense forests of eastern France during 1944, a quiet yet extraordinary transformation unfolded. Ukrainian soldiers, once members of the 30th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, began sabotaging the very military machine they had been forced to serve. These men shared food with starving civilians, rebuilt damaged infrastructure, and fought shoulder to shoulder with French resistance fighters in skirmishes and ambushes. In the Comfort woods, they dug trenches, raided Luftwaffe outposts, and destroyed German supply lines. Their first ambush led to the capture of German weapons and significant enemy losses. One resistance fighter remarked, "They fought like wolves, but not for Hitler anymore. They were trying to erase what that uniform once meant." From there, their campaign expanded rapidly. At Châlons-Passavant, they ambushed a retreating German patrol, delaying their advance and allowing Allied forces to reposition. At Lake Gromis, they carried out a joint raid with French partisans, placing explosives beneath a crucial bridge. In Ponder, they helped capture a strategic railway junction that disrupted Nazi supply lines across eastern France. These acts of defiance didn't go unnoticed. Some Ukrainian fighters were decorated with the Croix de Guerre, and a few even received France's highest military honor, the Légion d'honneur. Though these accolades didn't erase their SS past, they reframed their present. Still, the future remained uncertain. By September, these battalions had helped secure the Belfort Gap, opening the route to Alsace, but looming questions remained. Would they be repatriated and executed by the Soviets? Could France accept them? Many chose continued action. Some joined the French Foreign Legion, serving in Algeria and Indochina. Others disappeared into small towns, hiding their identities and past. Their old division, the so-called Ghost Division, had vanished from Nazi records, reborn as something else. Not fully French, not fully forgiven, but no longer the enemy. Yet despite the scale and significance of their mutiny, what followed was not celebration, but silence. Formed from disbanded collaborator units and Soviet POWs, the SS division had always been fragile. In August, that instability ruptured. The German response was brutal. Over 2,300 men were labeled unreliable, disarmed, and sent to build bunkers on the Western Wall. German records avoided the word mutiny. Files mention only reassignments and disbandments. Even Allied intelligence barely acknowledged it, relegating the event to local defections. In the Soviet Union, returning defectors faced execution or exile to the gulags. Many never returned. Those who refused the Legion slipped quietly into civilian life, hiding from both Soviet and Allied investigators. A few Russian and Belarusian members loyal to Germany were captured and forcibly repatriated, never to be heard from again. No trials were held. No official reckoning followed. Local French memories and scattered documents remain the only traces of this moment. Their silence was not surrender, it was survival. This forgotten mutiny wasn't loud, it was precise, deadly, and hidden in shadow, a quiet refusal to continue killing for a cause they had ceased to believe in.